off, traded, presumably made some profits. Those profits were shared according to the agreement that had been reached. If disaster somehow struck and the goods were lost, let us say at sea, the active worker would get nothing for his labor. The passive investor would lose his capital, but he couldn't lose anything more. He had limited liability. The fact that he had limited liability, that the passive investors had limited liability, actually encouraged a great deal of investment. It was a major contribution of Islam to commerce. Now, these Islamic partnerships were enforceable over a vast area. Merchants who used Islamic partnerships were active in most of the 8 major trading circuits of the Middle Ages. In fact, the only one that they were not used in, that Islamic partnerships were not used in, was the European trading circuit. Islamic partnerships were used in all of the other 7, and Middle Eastern merchants dominated 5 of the remaining 7 trading circuits. As merchants moved, they took their law with them, including their partnership law, helping to spread Islam. So Islam spread to parts of the East Asia and Southeast Asia through merchants. As merchants traveled, they took their law, and that encouraged a lot of conversions. Consequently, over a huge area that stretched at one point from Morocco and Spain in the west all the way to what is now Indonesia and the Chinese coast, people could conduct commerce under a more or less uniform legal system. They could have disputes, also disputes that arose in the course of commerce, adjudicated under a common legal system. Around the start of the 2nd millennium, essentially the same partnerships were used throughout the Mediterranean basin. Italians used a limited partnership form known as commenda. It was more or less the same as mudaraba. In fact, it is believed to have been descended from the mudaraba. What do we know about the size and longevity of Islamic partnerships? Islamic law put no limit on the number of people who can contribute labor or capital to a partnership, nor did it restrict how long the partnership would last. In principle, 50 people could pool labor and capital for a trading mission that was expected to last 3 years. However, in practice, the number of partners is usually 2. In the records, we sometimes run into partnerships involving 3 people, 4 people, 5 people. It's very rare to find partnerships that are any larger than that. So these were very small. These partnerships were very small by the standards of a modern enterprise. And the enterprise that was formed was limited typically to a single mission. You had a trade venture, let's say, that the 2 sides would agree to carry goods from Baghdad to Cairo and back, and then they would split the profits. The mission would be over. The pattern that I'm describing endured right up to the 19th century, right up to the time when Abdul-Majid got alarmed and decided to intervene from above by setting up a prototype of a different kind of enterprise. Here's what the size distribution of partnerships looked like in 17th century Istanbul. The figures are based on a huge data set that I've assembled over the last 5 years with the help of a number of research assistants. By the way, the largest data set of its kind, involving about 11,000 court cases drawn from the court archives of Istanbul and Galata, in other words, the Sijils. Now, what we see here is that large partnerships were quite rare. And this is exactly the pattern that Abdul-Majid notices in the mid-19th century, and the pattern that he tries to undermine by establishing a different kind of company. The other thing that I'd like to point out here is that there is no trend toward larger companies in the course of the 17th century. The size distribution is essentially stagnant. Now, at the end of a partnership, partners can, of course, enter into a new partnership. But note this, an Islamic traditional Islamic partnership is not what we call a firm or a corporation. It has no legal standing of its own, and it has no life of its own. In a modern firm, if an employee or a shareholder dies, the enterprise continues. If a member of an Islamic partnership dies, the partnership ends at that point by law, the assets are liquidated, and the deceased partner's assets are distributed to the deceased partner's heirs. Whether the interrupted business activity resumes will depend partly on the inheritance system in place. So let's take a look at the Islamic inheritance system to see what kind of incentives it might create for continuing a business that has been interrupted through death. After the rise of Islam, the Islamic inheritance system was the dominant inheritance system in the region. And according to rules laid out in the Quran, 2/3 of any estate is reserved for extended relatives of the deceased person. A daughter receives half the share of a son, an aunt receives half the share of an uncle, and so on for each category of relatives. The female shares half the male share. By medieval standards, this system was quite egalitarian. On the downside, however, this system made it difficult to keep property intact from one generation to the next. Successful businesses got fragmented after the founder. In principle, the heirs of a successful merchant could reconstitute a liquidated business, but there is a catch. The more heirs, the higher the costs of reconstituting the business, and hence the greater the cost of untimely termination. Successful merchants, those with large commercial operations, were most likely to have large numbers of heirs. Why? Because successful merchants were the ones who were able to have multiple wives. They had multiple wives, that meant that they had more children. Because they were wealthy, more of the children survived, which meant ultimately that when they died, they had more heirs. So the death of a partner was especially problematic if he was a successful businessman. Now, if premature dissolution was costly, members of partnerships would have tried to reduce the risk. How would they have done so? Well, the risk in question, the risk of premature termination, rises with partnership size. The larger the partnership, the greater the probability that one member of the partnership is going to die prematurely, is going to die during the contract period. And the risk also rises with the anticipated duration of the partnership mission. So merchants and investors would have minimized the risks involved, and therefore the costs of liquidation, by keeping their partnership small and by limiting the duration of the enterprise. We're going to go from Baghdad to Cairo and back. Then we end the partnership. If things have gone well, we might form a new partnership. But that's legally a completely different enterprise. Okay, so people would have formed small and simple and ephemeral companies. The same risk, of course, existed in Western Europe. Medieval Italian partnerships also became null and void if a partner died. But the inheritance system was different, and that had major consequences over the long run. The Bible does not explicitly specify an inheritance system, so there was vast experimentation in this area. It's not that people thought that the Bible didn't matter. Of course, the church took a great interest in the type of inheritance practices that people used. The thing is that since there is no explicit system in the Bible, it could be interpreted in many, many different ways. So there was vast experimentation in this area. Inheritance laws varied greatly across space in Europe, also across time. In a place as small as Moravia or Saxony, you could find multiple inheritance systems, very different inheritance systems. Some of these inheritance systems were even more egalitarian than the Islamic inheritance system, allowing even less choice to make a will, for example. But some of these inheritance systems were much less egalitarian. And one of these is of interest here, and this is primogeniture. Under primogeniture, the entire business falls to the oldest son. In places where primogeniture was practiced, this was primarily the northern countries, which ultimately led the Industrial Revolution, merchants knew that if one died, the son would take over. So they prearranged to have the son step in, and of course they brought the son into the enterprise early on as an apprentice, so we find out about the business. This was not necessarily good for the later sons, for the second son, third son, and so on. It was certainly not a good system for daughters who got nothing when their father passed away. But the system had one advantage. It reduced the risk of terminating a business early. In other words, it facilitated continuity over time, continuity in business over time. Now, why is this difference between the regions? And here, the regions in question are essentially Western Europe and the Middle East. Why is the difference between the regions significant for long-term economic development? Why are partnership size and longevity so important to start with? If the scale and longevity of business remain fixed, no pressures arise to develop more advanced business techniques. You don't develop the coordination problems and the communication problems that lead people to start thinking of developing new institutions, more advanced institutions. Okay? Institutions that are capable, organizational forms that are capable of supporting larger partnerships, 5 people, 10 people, eventually much more. Consider accounting. If partnerships are limited to 2 people and they're expected to last 3 months, there is no need for standardized accounting. Accounts are very simple. Okay. By contrast, if partnerships have 10 people at any one time and memberships can change over time, and it is known that memberships will change over time, shares are transferable, for example, from father to son, standardized bookkeeping becomes necessary. Okay? So in the West, as business forms evolved, modern accounting developed. In the Middle East, accounting practices did not change before the 19th century. And the reason is the need simply didn't arise. When the need arose in the 19th century, accounting conventions were ultimately imported from the West. Likewise, pressures to make shares tradable, company shares tradable, and to establish stock markets, these develop only when enterprises become long-lived. People want tradability to make their shares liquid. So no secondary markets for enterprise shares arose in the Middle East until the 19th century. So in the Middle East, in contrast to Europe, people's capital was never tied up for long anyway. When you have your capital tied up in a 2-person partnership that's expected to last for a very short time, you have liquidity by definition, so pressures don't arise to develop stock markets. So in short, in Europe, innovations started feeding upon themselves. In the Middle East, commercial institutions stagnated. Now, the persistent smallness of enterprises also limited the division of labor in commerce and finance. Table here shows distinct occupations in 2 periods in the Arab Middle East. So the figures here exclude Turkey and they exclude the Balkans. They also exclude Iran. The reason is that this is the only part of the world, the Arab world, for which we have this data. The work has been done. In principle, it could be done for Turkey as well, and I don't think we would come up with figures that would look quite different. So what are these distinct occupations? So spice sellers, one occupation, cloth makers, another occupation, judge is another occupation, etc. Now, we've known at least since Adam Smith that division of labor is one of the correlates of productivity and productivity improvements. Economies become more productive through specialization, and that comes from division of labor. What we see here is from figures for the number of distinct occupations in bureaucracy and military in the Middle East, a tripling. We see enormous dynamism in bureaucracy and in the state.